June 9, 1982. 25,000 feet above the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. The Mediterranean sun is not a warm embrace here. It is an interrogation lamp. It bakes the plexiglass canopy of Lieutenant Adnan al-Hamad's MiG-23 MF, turning the cockpit into a greenhouse of sweat and tension. Through the rubber of his oxygen mask, the recycled air tastes of stale rubber and anxiety. Below him, the Bekaa Valley is a patchwork quilt of greens and browns, an ancient chessboard where empires have clashed for millennia. But Adnan is not looking down. He is looking up into the azure emptiness. Up here, he believes he is a king. His confidence is not accidental. It is manufactured. It was drilled into him by Soviet instructors in Krasnodar for 2 years. They placed him in the centrifuge and spun him until the blood left his eyes, pushing his body to the ragged edge of consciousness. They forced him to memorize the performance envelope of his fighter jet until the machine was not a collection of bolts and hydraulics, but an extension of his own nervous system. Most importantly, they filled his mind with the unshakable truth of Soviet air combat doctrine. The MiG is a warrior's aircraft. It is rugged, it is simple, it is brutally effective. It is designed for the turn, for the merge, for that visceral moment when a pilot's courage is tested in a swirling knife fight a mile wide. Adnan and his wingmen are flying in perfect, disciplined formation. They are the product of a system that values the human element, the sheer grit of the man in the machine. They were taught to fear the enemy's numbers, yes, but never their technology. The political officers and the flight instructors were clear. American fighters are bloated. They are gold-plated toys filled with overly complex electronics that break if you look at them wrong. They are flown by soft, individualistic pilots who lack the collective will to fight. They are status symbols, not instruments of war. As Adnan scans his radar scope, a flicker of green phosphor disrupts the darkness. A contact. Then another. Then a dozen more. His heart hammers against his ribs, a familiar electric surge of adrenaline. This is what he trained for. The ground controller's voice crackles in his ear, calm and measured, the voice of the state guiding its hand. He vectors the squadron toward the Israeli formation. This is it, the moment of truth. Adnan prepares to jettison his external fuel tank. He readies himself to push the throttle past the detent into full afterburner, to feel the violent kick of the Tumansky R-29 engine behind him. As he dives into the approaching maelstrom, he visualizes the enemy, the American-made F-15 Eagles. He pictures pulling into a high G turn, his vision graying at the edges. He imagines forcing the heavier American fighter to bleed its energy, outturning the lumbering giant, sliding onto its 6 o'clock, and hearing the satisfying growl of his infrared missile locking onto the heat of its twin engines. He is ready for the glory. But the merge never comes. The sky in front of him remains terrifyingly empty. Suddenly, his radar screen, his eyes into the world beyond, dissolves. It becomes a chaotic mess of electronic noise, a storm of white snow and false targets. It is jamming, but not the crude interference he trained against. This is sophisticated, overwhelming. The ground controller's voice, once the calm voice of authority, is suddenly frantic, shouting conflicting commands. The connection to the hive mind is severing. Adnan's head whips from side to side, scanning the blindingly blue sky for a visual contact. Nothing. Just the sun and the silence. Then his headset screams. It is an electronic tone he has only ever heard in the safety of a simulator. It is the shrill, terrifying screech of a radar lock warning. Where? He snaps the control stick hard left. His G-suit inflates, crushing his legs as the jet lurches, his body heavy with gravity. But he has no idea what he is evading. He cannot see the attacker. He cannot see a missile trail. There is just the sound. A moment later, to his right, his wingman's MiG simply ceases to exist. It doesn't trail smoke. It doesn't spiral downwards in a cinematic death. One instant, it is a sleek metallic shape cutting through the air. The next, it is a silent, expanding fireball, a puff of orange and black that is instantly scattered by the relentless wind. Adnan stares, his mind refusing to process the image. There was no dogfight. There was no maneuvering. There was no test of courage. There was only an invisible enemy and instantaneous death. He is a master of a game that the enemy is no longer playing. In that moment of cold, stark terror, Lieutenant Adnan El-Hamid realizes that everything he has been taught is a lie. To understand the magnitude of Adnan's shock, we must peel back the layers of history and look at the factories and philosophies that built this moment. The world Adnan came from was built on the mythos of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet military doctrine was an ideology as much as a science, forged in the crucible of World War II's titanic Eastern Front. It was a philosophy of mass. Victory was achieved by overwhelming numbers, by the sheer resilience of the Russian soldier, and by machines that could be produced faster than the enemy could destroy them. This translated directly to aviation. The Mikhail Gorovich Design Bureau, the legendary MiG, created fighters that were the airborne equivalent of the T-34 tank. They were simple to produce in massive numbers. They were easy for conscript pilots to maintain and fly. The MiG-21 and its successor, the MiG-23, were designed as point defense interceptors. They were components in a larger system meant to be tethered to powerful ground-controlled intercept (GCI) stations. A pilot was not a commander. He was an actuator. He was told where to fly, what altitude to hold, and when to fire. Propaganda posters showed heroic Soviet pilots as eagles, soaring protectors of the motherland. Their instructors, veterans of proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam, spoke of American opponents with contempt. They argued that American pilots were products of a decadent capitalist society, reliant on technology, lacking discipline, and destined to fail in a pure test of skill. But across the globe, in the sterile laboratories and wind tunnels of McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, a completely different religion of air combat had been perfected. It was born from trauma. During the Vietnam War, American pilots in their powerful F-4 Phantoms had been stunned by the agility of the much older, simpler North Vietnamese MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The Americans had superior speed, but in the close-in turning fights over Hanoi, their technological edge was often negated. This shock led to a revolution, spearheaded by a brilliant, abrasive Air Force colonel named John Boyd and his fighter mafia. Boyd developed energy maneuverability, EM theory. This was a complex set of calculations proving that victory in air combat wasn't just about turning radius. It was about the ability to gain or lose energy, altitude, and airspeed faster than your opponent. It was about dictating the terms of the fight. The F-15 Eagle was the physical embodiment of John Boyd's brutal mathematics. Its design mandate was simple and uncompromising. Not a pound for air to ground. It was not a bomber. It was not a multi-role compromise. It was built for one purpose: to achieve and maintain absolute air superiority. To do this, it was given two massive Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines. These produced so much thrust that the Eagle had a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1:1. This meant it could accelerate while climbing vertically, a feat that seemed to defy the laws of physics and left Soviet intelligence analysts in disbelief. But the engine was just the muscle. The brain was the Hughes APG-63 pulse Doppler radar. This system was so advanced it could look down and distinguish a low-flying enemy fighter from the ground clutter of the earth below, a capability known as look down, shoot down. Soviet radars of the time were blinded by the reflection of the earth. The F-15's was not. This radar allowed the American pilot to see the enemy long before the enemy could see him. And to kill that enemy, it was armed with long-range radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. An F-15 pilot wasn't trained to get into a turning fight. He was trained to avoid it entirely. The American policy was first look, first shot, first kill. The goal was to destroy the enemy from beyond visual range, BVR, to win the battle before the opposing pilot even knew he was in one. Back in the Bekaa Valley, the turkey shoot had begun. The Syrian commanders, advised by their Soviet counterparts, were confident. They had established a formidable integrated air defense system, IADS, in the valley, a layered network of surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. In the air, they believed their numbers would overwhelm the Israelis. They were flying into a trap of such sophistication they couldn't even perceive the walls closing in. The moment of shock was not a single explosion, but a cascade of cognitive dissonance that shattered the Syrian pilot's reality in under 100 seconds. The first sign was the jamming. It wasn't just noise. It was a blizzard. The Israeli electronic warfare platforms were not just blocking signals. They were flooding the Syrian radar screens with false data. One moment, a pilot saw a dozen enemy contacts. The next, he saw 200. Then, none. Then came the silence. The ground controllers, the gods of the Soviet doctrine, were blinded. Their radar screens were whitewashed. They could not vector the MiGs. They could not warn them. The Syrian pilots were suddenly orphans in the sky, flying blind into a hurricane of invisible energy. Then came the sound. In the cockpit of a MiG-23, the radar warning receiver, RWR, is a simple instrument. A low chirp means a search radar is sweeping. A steady tone means a lock. The Syrian pilots began hearing the steady tone. The sound that meant death was looking for them. But it made no sense. They were miles away from where they thought the enemy was. Their training insisted that the American radar-guided missiles were unreliable. Yet the tone in their headsets was solid, insistent, and coming from everywhere. Panic set in. They scanned the empty blue. No enemy fighters, no smoke trails. It was a ghost story come to life. The first MiG exploded, then a second, then a third. The Syrian radios descended into chaos, screams, frantic calls for coordinates, the chilling sound of open microphones transmitting nothing but the roar of an engine followed by abrupt, static-filled silence. The Syrian pilots, trained for a ballet of close-range combat, were being systematically executed from a distance. They were targets in a shooting gallery picked off by marksmen they would never see. High above the slaughter, the Israeli F-15 pilots were experiencing a completely different reality. Their powerful radars cut through the jamming like a searchlight through fog. On their displays, each MiG was a clear, unambiguous green symbol. They could see altitude, airspeed, and heading. But they weren't working alone. Orbiting high above was the E-2C Hawkeye, an airborne command and control aircraft. The Hawkeye acted as an all-seeing eye. Its massive rotating rotodome scanned hundreds of miles of airspace. It filtered the data and broadcast a clean, godlike tactical picture directly to the fighters. The Israeli pilots were not lone wolves. They were neurons in a collective brain. While the Syrian pilot was struggling with a jammed radio and a blinded ground controller, the F-15 pilot was living inside a real-time, three-dimensional map of the entire war. They could be vectored to the perfect firing position without ever turning on their own radars, guiding on the passive information fed by the Hawkeye. They approached silently, like submarines in the deep. They would only light up the enemy in the final seconds to guide a missile. By the time the Syrian pilot's RWR screamed, the Sparrow missile was already terminal. It was traveling at 4 times the speed of sound. The impact was a formality. As the surviving Syrian pilots broke and fled, dragging their shattered confidence back to the tarmac, the numbers began to come in. In the first few minutes, over a third of the Syrian force had been destroyed. By the end of the campaign, the score would be staggering. 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed. 0 Israeli losses. 0. In the debriefing rooms, the Syrian pilots tried to explain, but they had nothing to report. They had seen no enemies. They had fought no dogfights. They spoke of phantom missiles and screens gone haywire. The Soviet advisors initially blamed the pilots. They called them cowards. It was the only explanation that fit their worldview. But as the technical data emerged, a cold dread took hold in Moscow. This was not a failure of courage. It was the obsolescence of an entire era. Almost a decade later, the lesson would be taught again. This time, in the cold, clear skies over Iraq. January 1991. Operation Desert Storm. Saddam Hussein's Air Force was even more confident than the Syrians had been. They possessed the MiG-29 Fulcrum. The MiG-29 was the Soviet Union's direct answer to the F-15. On paper, it was a terrifying machine. It was wickedly agile. It possessed a helmet-mounted sight that allowed the pilot to aim missiles simply by looking at a target, a capability the Americans did not yet have. It was a near-peer adversary. Iraqi pilots believed they were the best in the Arab world. They had studied the Bekaa Valley. They believed new tactics would close the gap. On the second day of the war, Captain Jamil Sayhood of the Iraqi Air Force climbed into his MiG-29. His mission? Intercept an American strike package. He took off, vectored west by GCI. The plan was to use ground clutter to hide, to pop up, and to force the merge where the MiG-29 could use its superior agility. As he leveled off at 20,000 feet, his reality began to fracture. His RWR chattered with confusing signals. His radar scope filled with electronic snow. His controller's voice became tense. Captain Sayhood scanned the sky. A perfect, empty blue. He felt the sensation of being watched. He never knew that 40 miles away, Captain Cesar Rico Rodriguez, flying an F-15C for the USAF 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing, had been tracking him for 3 minutes. To Rodriguez, Sayhood was a simple green carrot on a display. He watched the Iraqi fly a predictable straight line. Rodriguez checked his clearance with the AWACS, the more advanced successor to the Hawkeye. He selected an AIM-7 Sparrow. Fox 1. The missile leaped off the rail. A few seconds later, Sayhood's headset erupted with the high-pitched, solid tone of a terminal threat. He had less than 5 seconds to live. He broke hard, pulling the MiG into a desperate high-G turn, but he was reacting to a ghost. He had no idea where the missile was coming from. His wingman watched in horror as Captain Sayhood's brand-new MiG-29 was violently ripped in half by the proximity-fused warhead. The wreckage tumbled to the desert floor. The engagement had taken place entirely beyond visual range. Sayhood never saw Rodriguez. Rodriguez never saw Sayhood except as a smear of smoke after the kill. They called the F-15 the Monster. In the 43 days of the air war, F-15s would score 34 confirmed air-to-air kills. 0 F-15s were lost in air-to-air combat. The true weapon of the F-15 was not the missile, it was the fear. As the war dragged on, a specific and debilitating F-15 phobia took hold of the Iraqi Air Force. The recurring symbol of American power was that high-pitched electronic tone in the headset. It was the sound of an unseen, untouchable, omniscient foe. Pilots began to develop mysterious mechanical problems on the flight line. They would refuse to fly, citing maintenance issues that ground crews could never find. They knew their leaders were sending them out not to fight, but to be bait. During the years of the no-fly zones, Operations Northern and Southern Watch, this psychological torture was refined. An Iraqi pilot might try to test the boundary. He would fly toward the 33rd parallel. He would see nothing. Then his RWR would light up. First a chirp, then a lock. The Americans were watching. They were painting him with radar, letting him know he was targeted. It was a tap on the shoulder from the Reaper. Faced with certain death or humiliating retreat, the pilot would turn back. The sky, once the medium of the fighter pilot's glory, had been transformed into a source of constant dread. The cockpit became a coffin waiting for a nail. The ultimate demonstration of this supremacy happened not in the air, but on the ground. February 26, 1991. The Highway of Death. A massive convoy of Iraqi armor and looted vehicles attempted to flee Kuwait City. They were caught in a bottleneck on Highway 80. Because the F-15s had swept the skies clean, The F-15E Strike Eagle, the ground attack variant, could operate with impunity. Using lantern targeting pods, the Strike Eagle crews turned the desert night into day. On their screens, the heat of the truck engines glowed ghostly white against the cool desert sand. To the men on the ground, it was a descent into hell. They heard the whistle of falling ordnance, followed by the deafening crump of cluster munitions. The F-15Es acted as airborne snipers, methodically dismantling the convoy vehicle by vehicle. There was no resistance. There were no enemy fighters to drive them off. The Iraqi army was left naked and defenseless because they had lost the sky. This was not a battle. It was an industrial annihilation. It was the final brutal proof that without air superiority, a modern army is just a collection of targets. The story of the F-15's triumph is the epilogue to the Cold War. The Soviet Union believed that the complexities of American technology were a weakness, a bourgeois excess that would fail in the mud and blood of real war. They trusted in the mass, the grit, the simple machine. They were wrong. The Americans hadn't just built a better fighter. They had built a system that made the dogfight, the very core of Soviet aviation identity, irrelevant. They replaced the test of a pilot's courage with a cold mathematical equation of detection ranges and kill probabilities. The Soviet-trained pilots, who were laughed at by their instructors for fearing the flying tennis court, were vindicated in the worst possible way. They were the ones who had to face the reality that their courage was useless. A former Soviet aviation general, reflecting on the lessons of the Gulf War, was quoted as saying, "We always knew the Americans were ahead of us. We did not know they were on a different planet." The laughter died in the skies over the Bekaa Valley, replaced by the chilling silence of open radio channels. The final verdict was delivered not by treaties, but by the physics of a radar-guided missile launched from the future. The monster was real. And it proved once and for all that in the age of modern warfare, the sky belongs to the one who can see.